So welcome everybody to the Blue Economy CRC's final webinar for 2022. I'm John Whittington and I'm the CEO of the Blue Economy CRC. First, on behalf of the Blue Economy CRC, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today. I'd also like to pay my respects to elders past and present and their Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. For those that don't know, the Blue Economy CRC was established with a 10-year life under the Australian Government CRC program in July 2019. Now with 43 participants from Australia and around the globe, we have a clear purpose to perform world-class, collaborative, industry-focused research and training that underpins the growth of the blue economy through increased offshore sustainable agriculture and renewable energy production. The Blue Economy CRC has now been going for 3.5 years and we've got a really extensive portfolio of research. But today we're going to talk about a year ago, and which we released with a couple of reports quite recently. The two reports that Angela and I are going to talk to you today about. The first is Tasmania Sustainable Ocean Economy Beyond 2033, or the Ambition, as we call it, the Ambition document, and also another report called What We Heard. And this relates to a series of workshops and a symposium which we conducted through this year. And What We Heard records all of the information that we heard from research, from industry, and from interest groups across Tasmania and more broadly. What we are going to be doing today is just taking you through those reports, and I'll make the assumption that you've seen them, but if you haven't seen them, I really ask you to have a good look at those, and they can be found on our website. And if you go to the chat function in our website, you'll see a link to where both of those reports can be found. The way we'll structure today is that I'll hand over to Ange in a moment, and Ange will take you through the work and through our findings. And then we've left a lot of time at the end for questions. And we would really like to have a discussion at the end around the ambition and what we found. You can also throw questions at us along the way through the chat function, and we'll either try and answer them on the fly, or if not, we'll try and get to them at the end of the session. But in summary, based on the work that we've done, the Ambition proposes, as this slide says, a new approach to sustainable ocean industries and ocean stewardship for Tasmania, where we're balancing nature and supporting that with innovation. We've used the Tasmanian salmon industry as a way of having a look at how this sustainable ocean industry approach could be rolled out. But it's equally applicable, and in fact it includes all ocean industries, whether it's offshore renewable energy or some of the more existing industries like wild fisheries, transport, tourism, as well as other uses of the oceans, including wreck fishing, boating and the like. And as I've said before, it draws on the input from symposiums and forums that we've run, and from hundreds of contributions that we've had at those events. And the material we've sort of researched, both best practice around Australia and the world. So we're really proud of the work that we've done. We see it as a starting point for a conversation. It's by no means the end. And we are hoping to build on this ambition over the coming year to look at different sectors and how they could be incorporated into this ambition, but also how different geographies can be brought into it as well. But with that, I'll hand over to Ange to take you through the work that we've done.
Thank you, John, and thank you everybody for joining us today. We're super close to Christmas, and I hope everyone is enjoying their last weeks in the lead up to Chrissy or their breaks. And so thank you very much for your time today. I'm the newest member of the Blue Economy CRC team. I joined now 6 months ago, and I've been really fortunate to come into this particular process that we're going to be taking you through today. As John touched on, what we're really taking you through and this approach that we've got in front of us, and like John said, I really hope everyone has had the chance to read these documents so we can have a really meaty discussion. But it really was along the lines of how do you couple sustainable ocean industries with ocean stewardship here in Tasmania in the first instance? How do you bring in philosophies and approaches like balancing with nature? And how equally do you support this direction, this ambition, this piece with innovation? Because what we do today and how we do it might look very different in the future. So the benefit of operating off the Tasmanian salmon industry means that we've got a lot of great data in front of us. We've got a lot of experience, and we've also got a very public-facing issue or opportunity at the same time to really explore. So, starting with our ocean economy more broadly, what am I talking about? Well, I'm talking about those traditional industries, the ones that have been around for a long time, that have really mature regulatory and planning foundations, that have strong administrative supports. And typically you'll see their name in the title of a department, or at least an office within those departments. So we're talking, wild catch, aquaculture, those more new emerging industries that sit around ocean renewable energy, wind, wave, biofuel. But we've also captured industries such as research and the different approaches that research agencies look like: defence, training, transport, infrastructure, energy more broadly, the traditional oil and gas, tourism and business services. And then the other piece to this of an ocean economy is it's ocean industries, but it's also the ocean services. So when we said balance with nature, these are some of the concepts that we're really trying to promote and amplify and get back onto the policy sheets of government, and also the balance sheets of industry and others who are also looking at oceans more broadly. So here's where we're talking about renewable and non-renewable resources. We're talking about the biosphere, talking about the flow of ecosystems and abiotic services, nutrients, carbon, oxygen, how a lot of commercial industries are actually managed, sits around their what they excrete, what comes out, what are their streams of waste which fit in those. And then social capital, so attitudes, cultural practice, amenity, health, well-being, and recreational. And as John touched on, our recreational is clearly an ocean service, but technically you could pop recreational fisheries also as an ocean industry as well. Within the global ocean space, there are a number of global trends that are impacting those industries. And I'm really going to look into the aquaculture industry more broadly. And through the pieces of work that we've done and through the broader role of the Blue Economy CRC, we have this opportunity to really identify these global trends and then look at what they are doing around influencing the producers, but also consumers and ultimately governments and government policy. So between FAO and then also CSIRO's megatrends work, there's been quite a lot in the aquaculture space of relevance, such as, of course, climate change, major global trend, a lot happening from a political level, from a finance level, but also from an action level. And, if you're reading through the FAO work, they'll be encouraging people to increase consumption of fish as a way to reduce global greenhouse gas emissions when compared to other protein sources, but also improve human health. And how do you incorporate climate change considerations into dietary and nutritional choices? Population growth, world's population is increasing. That's continuing. We also have a growing middle class, and as a result of that growing middle class, we've got access to income, and we've got an interest in those nutritional profiles that I was touching on earlier. There really is an increased focus on solutions around leaner, cleaner and greener. Consumers are more literate around sustainability and other aspects like that. And then they have expectations on what they will be consuming and what the companies and governments that operate around them are focused on. Globally, fisheries are fully or overexploited, and I appreciate within different regions and geographies that might not always be the case, but as a whole, that's FAO's position. And we live longer, which sort of, builds off some of those other pieces that I touched on there. So our people part of the equation is certainly shifting and changing as we continue. And then there's this human dimension. There's a really strong consumer and citizen push for government and decision makers to put trust up front, to be more transparent and fair, to be more environmentally conscious in how they're going through activities and regulating economic growth. So if I bring aquaculture down into our neighbourhood at the moment and our focus and topic, it really sits around Tasmanian farm salmon as our case study. And by the numbers, and these need to be updated off the back of the ABARES report that was just circulated recently. But where that industry is really fitting at the moment, and it is the largest fishery in Australia, is that we have 83,000 tonnes of salmon produced. That's been produced over an annual year from 3,222 hectares. You're looking at 900 million. That's increased according to the ABARES work. And you've got about just shy of 3,000 staff employed through that particular sector, with a multiplier that puts you at about 10,000 indirect in that workforce. Of the product that we've touched on, approximately a third is exported, and that shifts and changes depending on domestic demand. So there's sector statistics that you would expect with any ocean industry that looks at seafood production, for example. But one of the other pieces to the by the numbers for the Tassie farmed salmon really sits around community sentiment. And so the Tasmanian Salmon Growers Association, now Salmon Tasmania, has undertaken 3 community sentiment surveys over the last 18 or so months. Now, these are 6-monthly surveys that go out to 1,000 Tasmanians. And from those Tasmanians, there are a series of questions around support, opposition, around importance, but also around a variety of factors that are really critical as to why do you support, what do you think this industry is offering. And so there's some really interesting qualitative information there. But what you can see here is that 69% of the respondents said that this is an industry that's important, and the importance is because it provides jobs and food for Tasmanians. But 87% of those respondents said, well, the public needed more information on this industry. And then when you're looking at how many support the industry, remember, we're looking at a picture of 1,000 Tasmanians, or 57% support. You got 19% that are neutral, 20% that oppose, and 4% that are unsure. And if you do the math and scale that up, they're pretty significant numbers at the end of the day. Just shy of 300,000 supporting, but then your neutrals just shy of 100,000, and then your opposition is also 100,000. So there's a number of people out there that are really looking for more information and are trying to get their head around what this industry offers them. So with that in mind, looking at that global perspective and that broader aquaculture perspective, the Blue Economy CRC starting point on this particular work really focused on capturing points of view. It was around an opportunity that was made available through some work with the Tasmanian Government as part of their, or adjacent to their formal process for developing a 10-year salmon plan. So the Blue Economy CRC entered into a project agreement with the government in early 2022 to host 2 stakeholder-focused events and report on what was heard. So back in May, there was a salmon symposium held, and it brought together local, national, global leaders, aquaculture experts from all over the place, practitioners and stakeholders. A forum was held in mid-August, which comprised of 2 separate workshops and a series of one-on-one conversations with targeted stakeholders. And that really went to the next level, capturing visions, aspirations, building blocks of sustainable aquaculture, but also what are some of those challenges that interest groups and industry and research are facing. So what did we hear? Well, the directions and trends from the symposium were really interesting. You know, nearly 300 odd people that attended either face-to-face or online, and they were able to really get a bit of a picture of the Tasmanian aquaculture industry, while strongly responsive and driven by ESG, so environmental, social, and governance factors. And they were focused on that, but also delivering and reporting on progress. That was really evident. Those characteristics of the industry, as we heard, was highly innovative, capital intensive, rapidly changing, forward-looking, rooted in that environmental social governance angle, and a highly skilled workforce. But we also heard that salmon farming operates in a highly valued and contested waterway. And within the community, there are concerns with that long-term health of the marine environment. We've got 2 sides here of the conversation. Don't expect you to read everything here. If you're like me, you're going to look at it and you're going to sort of see some words that stand out to you. Because what we did through the forum and these workshops were we asked questions of our participants. We had, so workshop 1 had participants across industry, research, and that broader supply chain, so feed companies, for example. And then workshop 2 had local community and interest groups were present, and they got asked the same questions. And some of those questions I'll take you through today. One was, well, what are the opportunities for Tasmanian salmon in the context of blue economy? And our forum participants ranged, well, these opportunities sat around climate change, for example, that focus on sustainability and those carbon positive aspirations, the need for stronger community relationships and meaningful community relationships, a collaborative industry, integrated planning, evidence-based actions, further innovation and R&D. And if you just have a look through some of these, it's pretty clear that not all of these are 100% relevant or isolated just to Tasmanian salmon. A lot of these are broader. They're about, good practice for oceans more broadly, and especially integrated oceans governance and oceans management. They're much broader than just, and their ability to move the dial or move these forward are going to, will need to be achieved by more than just policy or planning around Tasmanian salmon. And that was certainly the case as well for the challenges. When we asked our participants, well, take us through the challenges that you see, again, in the context of Tasmanian salmon in that broader blue economy, that ocean space. Those key themes sat around trusting government and industry, this need to communicate with impact, this workforce pride, need for transparency and greater transparency, this responsible use of public waterways, climate, and this, again, back to the climate low zero carbon aspirations. So the What We Heard report, which is available on the website, really details all of this information extremely raw. It is opinions that have been put forward through those sessions, and they've just been recorded and just captured in that very raw way. And that's a really interesting and novel and kind of exciting way to really understand what matters to the people that we've spoken to, because understanding these values and experiences, the concerns that we've heard, but also these aspirations, it can help not just government, but it can help a number of other stakeholders in understanding what collaboration could look like, what a pathway together could look like, and what some of those strategic directions are that are needed moving ahead. So off the back of that, here we are. We've also got, parallel to this, some of the biggest oceans initiatives happening in the world. At that point, you had over in Barcelona, World Ocean Conference. It was the first one for a number of years. And, you've got the Secretary General of the United Nations calling out this particular quote, which I think is really interesting. And it certainly frames up what's ahead if you are looking to match what your activities are with what the expectations are. But he was very clear. He was urging stakeholders to invest in sustainable ocean economies, bringing back to basics for food, renewable energy, and livelihoods. He believes sustainable oceans management can help the ocean produce as much as 6 times more food globally and generate 40 times more renewable energy than it currently does. But to be able to achieve that, you need sustainable business models to operate in harmony with the marine environment and to guarantee a sustainable seafood industry. So with that framing, really what was going on globally and what that broader directive was, became very clear to us that a salmon plan might make perfect sense from a government perspective with where they are at the moment, but there really was this opportunity to look broader, this ability to characterise what Tasmania's sustainable oceans could look like, and ultimately, what could good look like? What could good look like when it comes to oceans management, oceans governance, and ocean stewardship, and ultimately give a guiding star, a guiding pathway for those ocean economies. So we created or got together to start creating an ocean ambition, starting with Tasmania, looking at oceans more broadly, and then, as John and I touched on earlier, really applying that to the Tasmanian salmon industry. So that ambition at the top is for a sustainable ocean economy underpinned by innovative industries and trusted stewardship of all of our oceans and the services that they provide. So when you've got efforts like blue carbon and aspects like that, where nature-based solutions are coming to the forefront, what we're really trying to offer is an umbrella ambition, something that unites all of those pieces and has an integrated and holistic driver. So if that's your oceans, but what could that look like for Tasmanian salmon? Okay, well, our proposal is that a thriving Tasmanian aquaculture industry where sustainable growth is defined by the capacity of the natural system using an ocean economy balance sheet, balanced with nature and supported by innovation. How do you achieve that ambition? Well, we sat there, we went back and reviewed all the material that came from the symposium and those workshops, and we looked at what some of those points of commonality were, but then equally how to look around at other jurisdictions, other existing industries, and other motivators and drivers to determine what we believe are 6 really important opportunities available in the Tasmanian sense, but ultimately could be scaled up to other geographies, other jurisdictions, and other industries, of course. And they sat around integrated oceans management, contemporary oceans leadership, contemporary ocean planning and regulation, building an ocean economy balance sheet, meaningful collaboration. And then here is where we've subbed in what I call a chapter for Tasmanian salmon, but it was that contemporary ocean industry. What makes these ocean industries contemporary, able to deal with what's around the corner, those mega trends, those expectations? As we've touched on, we've used Tasmanian salmon as our example. So supporting sustainable food, growing the ocean workforce, growing aquaculture diversity and opportunity, and driving innovation, as well as decarbonising operations. So for each of those opportunities, we've put forward hopefully what will be seen as a little package to really insight and provide a blueprint or how to move forward on those. So for example, you know, in the Tasmanian context, there is an absence of integrated oceans management per se. So we've talked about, you know, what is integrated oceans management? How do you consider industries alongside one another and provide a much more integrated and holistic approach to managing the ocean estate? But we've also provided a goal, which is delivering an integrated oceans management framework. And we've framed up some actions there that we think are really important steps towards achieving that. And some of those are around, for example, courageous conversations within our stakeholders, looking at what that shared commitment to an integrated oceans management framework could look like. Stock take on the tools that are available in other jurisdictions and other places around that support integrated oceans management, like marine spatial planning, and then approaches like ecosystem-based management. We've put forward what we believe those impacts are. If you're able to achieve this, you're going to get industry and user certainty, which allows for, you know, commercialization, investment, and ultimately not just investment in growth, but investment back into innovation and investment back into ESG, so there's environmental social governance outputs as well. This will also work towards maintaining that healthy and productive ecosystem that we're all seeking, using things like knowledge-based planning and management, and ultimately increasing transparency. So case study we've put forward here is how the New South Wales government has undertaken their marine estate management. It's a gold star if you're looking across jurisdictions in Australia. It's a really interesting approach. It's been in play for a number of years now. A lot of lessons learned, but certainly is one of the best examples of integrated oceans management on the table. And there's a lot more to go in that particular space, but you are looking at waterways adjacent to some of the biggest cities, and a lot of industry and activity. So there's some really neat aspects there that have, you know, really reinforced how to deal with and offer a collegial, a way forward for so many stakeholders and community, as well as commercial, and then the government decision makers as well. Contemporary oceans leadership. Well, ultimately, to achieve integrated oceans management and achieve what it is we're talking about, you are really looking towards your leaders, whether that's in government, in commercial, in research, in the community, for this contemporary ocean leadership. And where I think we're seeing it today, right now, is off the back of COP over in Montreal, the Convention on Biological Diversity, or the Nature COP, or the Biodiversity COP, where you've got a number of world leaders who have come together and said, we're going to really lead on these issues. This is something really important to us. We're going to unlock sustainable financing to support this, and we're going to, really reinforce that these are our new expectations of industry, of governance, and of community engagement and practices. Move that away from biodiversity for a moment, and that same desire is also there for contemporary ocean leadership, not just in necessarily Tasmania, probably Australia more broadly. And we're in a position where our Prime Minister is a member of the high-level panel for sustainable ocean economy. So there are some formats already that are available that are really defining what contemporary ocean leadership can look like. What are those priorities? And what are some of the outputs that are expected? And these are, courageous conversations. They're bold actions, but they're also really around offering confidence and policy principles and guidance to really support how you participate in these processes and how you manage expectations. So again, there's a goal, there's a series of actions, and there are various impacts. And so in this particular case, some of those actions, are sitting around investing in ocean literacy, blue knowledge, and technological innovations. It's an alignment of policy and strategy and activity to deliver this ambition. Being transparent about activities and impacts and dependencies, and adopting and championing that clear, bold, shared ambition up the top, which is a really important piece. So some of the features of best practice, well, it's a shared ocean. So you need to recognize that and what that means. It needs to be comprehensive. All stakeholders have that leadership role. You need to delineate what roles are so that it's really clear about who is doing what and how, and ultimately accountability, which is something that sometimes goes missing. Partnerships and collaboration, trust, which we touched on, such an important piece from earlier on, and being flexible. It needs to be able to adjust and adapt enough to the agile cadence of what's going on at the moment and beyond what we're talking about today as priorities and new information comes to the table. So contemporary ocean planning and regulation was another of those. And I'm going to pop this to John because I'm really quite fortunate with John's history and his background, having someone who has such a strong idea on what and experiences on what contemporary planning and regulation could look like. But ultimately, the goal here is how do you have a planning and regulatory environment that attracts and enables sustainable aquaculture while balancing those social, economic, and environmental interests? I'm going to pop myself on mute for a minute and I'll just pop you over to John.
Thanks, Ange. This is why Ange gets 3 minutes to have a glass of water and continue on, because you're doing a lot better job than I'll ever do. But on this, as Ange said, the challenge is how do you develop fit-for-purpose frameworks that drive innovation, provide business with confidence, but also protect the interests of community. Legislation by its nature is often a point in time in the way it's built and introduced. And so, for example, in the Tasmanian salmon industry, the relevant legislation that managed the planning and the regulation is really last century's thinking. It's legislation that was built in the 1990s, probably built on thinking that was in the late 80s. And the sorts of concepts that Ange has been talking through around integrated oceans management, contemporary leadership, and she'll talk about ocean economy balance sheets and the like. These are all policy innovations that our regulatory system is not attuned to. And so what I want to talk a little bit about is how do you build a regulatory environment, a planning environment that actually is forward-looking and incentivizes innovation. And it's not just about policy innovation, it's also about technological innovation. So when the legislation that is used to administer Tasmanian salmon was drafted, there wasn't a commercial industry for salmon at that point in time. So the legislation was written in the absence of experience. If we even go back 10 years, we didn't have well boats like we do now. The technologies around RAS systems were different. So that changes the nature of the fish that you put to sea and how they can be farmed. The use of AI, machine learning, the types of numerical modelling that we can do are all very different to what was available to governments, industry and the community only 10 years ago, 5 years ago. So the sorts of things that we need to be doing in our planning and regulatory environment is building systems that are forward-looking and agile, that promote innovation. So they should be sufficiently flexible to make use of new technologies where they're available. But they also should not inhibit the use of new technologies that are going to increase sustainability. As an example, and it's a hypothetical one, but we are working on projects to couple offshore renewable energy with hydrogen production so we can have an off-grid solution for the energy supply for an aquaculture facility. But right now, the regulatory environment, you wouldn't even begin to contemplate trying to put that through a planning and approval process because the systems haven't thought about how to deal with that. And so the risk for taking on new innovation is just amplified through I guess a backward-looking or a point-in-time type regulatory system. So the things that we're looking for, and we've dispelled this out in the same way as described around actions and impacts, things like developing an environment that incentivises emerging technologies and innovative solutions. It's about removing regulatory barriers to innovation. So right now, it's extremely hard to get approval for a range of technologies because they've never been used before and the regulatory environment doesn't contemplate them. We've got to work out how to remove those regulatory barriers. It's not about doing things short-circuiting them. It's about how do you do it in a safe and sustainable way, but be forward-thinking. So you incentivise innovation. You need to develop regulation that's flexible, adaptable to change and transparent. So as we learn things, we should be able to adapt what we're doing to improve, as opposed to locking in a practice that might not be best practice. That's because that's what you're required to do because of the way we've written our regulations. We want outcome-based regulatory measures that incentivises innovation. So focus on what it is that we want and not try and regulate the inputs, but regulate the outcomes. So that allows you to be flexible and allows you to innovate going forward. Often and this goes right, it's not just an oceans issue, it's right across the regulatory environment. We set license conditions and then move on to the next, as a regulator, onto the next task. And what we do is we end up with stuff in our regulatory environment that's out of date, that can be duplicative, it can be unnecessary, and so we should be constantly going back and checking that what we're requiring of industry, of the community, is actually relevant and current. We've got to ensure that community interests are considered in the planning and regulatory process and in decisions. I think that's self-evident why I'm saying that. And to the extent that it's possible, harmonisation across jurisdictions is really important. Obviously, learning from each other is really important. But when we're working in the oceans that has multiple jurisdictions operating across our oceans, having 8 different ways of doing the same thing leads to all sorts of inefficiencies and inequities and can distort all sorts of good decision making. So if we can get this right, then the impacts I think are quite profound, and they go to increase confidence in our regulatory environment, reduce business costs and risks, and increased investment in sustainable activities. You're incentivising sustainable activity investment, increased competitiveness of both states in the sense of where as a place to operate, but also in the businesses that are operating there, and increased innovation for sustainability. So I think, Ange, I'll hand it back to you there, but that's kind of my 3-minute version of what I would like to see in contemporary ocean planning and regulation.
Oh, thank you so much, John, and I really appreciate that and certainly appreciate your insights. Contemporary ocean and planning and regulation is such an important piece of the broader puzzle here. Just moving on. So John touched on one of the other more contemporary processes or approaches that we've put forward. One of these is an ocean economy balance sheet. And that really is pivoting off that concept we've put forward, which is around defining the capacity of a natural system and balancing through nature and also supporting with innovation. So there's quite a lot of work going on at the moment around ocean accounts and ocean accounting, and it's a really important addition to the bottom line and to integrating nature and biodiversity related elements back into the balance sheet. But as anyone who's worked in sustainability or ESG reporting knows, it's not just about nature, and it's certainly not just around profit. The language and concepts that are being discussed and have been, really sitting within investor space for quite a while sits around that environmental social governance. So people, planet, prosperity, and your product that you're offering. So how do you report against those? Now, the reality is there's a lot of reporting frameworks already out there, and the bigger end of town are already held to account, especially if you're ASX listed. Now, the reporting you might do might be, 100 odd page sustainability report. It might be data books that are provided to investors and then analysed by benchmarkers who are global, like Bloomberg, Sustainalytics, or FAIR, for example, who look at protein reporting and transparency. But again, they're all fit for purpose based on who that end user is. And more often than not, the end user is not me and you. It's not the consumer. It's not always the retailer. And so it's not always put into language that necessarily makes sense as a system. And also the other piece to that is that it's quite spend quite a lot of time contributing to those processes, and does it really move the dial from an ESG outcome perspective, from a commercial perspective? I guess there are a number of question marks around that. So what we're really trying to propose with this ocean economy balance sheet is integrating the commercial reporting and accountability and transparency with government decision making across seascapes or ocean areas, where you're able to look at pluses and minuses across a balance sheet or a profit loss statement from that ecosystem perspective, from people, from waste, from greenhouse gas emission, from freshwater use, from a variety of other systems that have been identified as important. And this really is about trying to develop something that sits across all those different users beyond. It's that next evolution of ocean accounting, that it allows for trade-offs and discussions of offsets in a much more meaningful way, especially during that transition period before you're able to achieve zero or being able to produce positive related outputs in the case of biodiversity through restoration, through nature-based solutions like shellfish additions or seaweed additions into particular geographies and in environments. So this is a really interesting piece of work, and the Blue Economy CRC has a really amazing ocean accounting project underway. There's also a marine spatial planning project underway. Those particular projects would probably be contributors to this broader concept here, which is really trying to put forward those trade-offs and that conversation around ESG clusters, and allow individuals to make decisions on the job, whether you're industry or from a decision-making regulatory perspective or from a commercial perspective. If you're trying to choose or make decisions or line up these operations against your own values across supply chain, you're able to really understand in a more transparent way. But it also provides a really interesting opportunity for another credible peer-reviewed evidence basis that can really, improve, enhance, and amplify that conversation around sustainability when it comes to farm seafood or other ocean industries beyond this. So being able to establish this ocean economy balance sheet to support government and industry decision-making and communication across ESG impacts at the seascape level. So some of the actions we've identified sits around, well, let's map those ESG values. What are people already doing in that space? Whether you're an investor, whether you're shareholders, whether you're government, whether you're retailers, whether you're third-party accreditations. How do you map First Nation cultural values as well? This is an opportunity to really put forward that cultural license to operate piece of work that's underway also by the Blue Economy CRC, and put it into a much broader context, but ultimately provide certainty on what those conversations could be and could look like. Developing the Oceans Economy balance sheet model, auditing contemporary ocean mapping and data sets, the data engine that sits behind this, stop taking those national and international activities that are underway, whether it's EBM or marine spatial planning. Profiling and supporting nature-based solutions, wetland and seaweeds for removing nutrients, for example. I read somewhere that inland water-based solutions are called teal, and then coastal and beyond are blue. Anyway, don't know what that is necessarily, but it's, you know, people are definitely looking at what those solutions are that are available from nature more broadly. And the other piece of an ocean economy balance sheet is we're humans at the end of the day. And so the ability to integrate a circular economy and be able to follow waste and be able to look at how you can reduce and reuse and repurpose or assimilate these waste streams, depending on what product you're talking about, is going to be a really important piece in moving forward. So the impacts of this kind of activity, well, you're reducing risk for these new emerging and transitioning industries. You've got this enhanced ecosystem understanding and oversight of cumulative impacts. There are incentives there for innovation and investment, incentives and rewards for early adapters and early responders, because ultimately these all come with a cost. But it's certainly in the long run, it's worth it. So how are you achieving neutral and positive impacts on those ESG values? Promotion of nature-based solutions in our industries and increasing that circular economy outcome that I touched on earlier. Whoops. So sorry, meaningful collaboration was one of those other pivot areas and, pillar areas, sorry. And that really was, again, based on what we'd heard through our conversations with a variety of people who care very, very deeply about oceans and ocean use, and are really looking towards government and industry and others in the Tasmanian sense to create a much more collaborative approach and ultimately drive meaningful and this shared ocean stewardship. Because right now we're at a point where, in the context of Tasmania, there's a lot of distrust around various sectors and groups. So we were definitely looking at what a reset could look like to improve that relationship. And how do you provide for that meaningful engagement? And again, there are examples around Australia of what stewardship can look like, what meaningful engagement can look like. How do you introduce appropriate consultation mechanisms, which are some of the actions we'd identified? Could you co-develop a pledge, a pact, a commitment to a shared outcome in this space? So what are some of those industry best practice principles or codes of practice or standards? Because ultimately those models for engagement or those processes I've touched on provide certainty to those who care about the ocean, who are looking to see how this industry is operating and seeking transparency. Because at the end of the day, the ocean space they're using is ultimately the commons, and it's run through, Crown in this particular case. So how do you establish community access programs for particular areas, so annual community tours or open days, and how do you continue to investigate those perceptions and sentiment? And ultimately, how do you also map material topics? So what matters to the community, what matters to industry, and then how do you identify and look at those shared values and look at what needs to be done in that space? Interest groups and those that are valuing oceans, they are certainly looking, from our conversations, for a more holistic approach to managing reporting on the health of that marine estate. And in the case of Tasmania, in the absence of government-led policies for the ocean estate, including on marine protected areas, it's certainly driven a perception that government favours sectoral interests over those contemporary and integrated oceans management approaches. So in New South Wales, again, their EPA has developed quite a contemporary approach to partnerships, and it's got various attributes such as collaborative, longer term, non-transactional relationship between multiple parties, cross-sector, including different stakeholders and types, shared interest, overlapping interest around an environmental challenge. And if there's a shared problem, there's a strong reason to be able to partner in this space. Compatibility, complementarity, sharing of risk, For all parties who share that risk, then they've got that incentive to engage, and those significant synergies and win-wins where you've got outcomes that are, broader than a single organisation and able to offer wins and successes for all the participants who are partnering on that particular issue. So as I touched on earlier, we've looked at this very much through the lens of Tasmanian salmon. And so in taking that even further, what does a contemporary ocean industry look like in the context of Tassie salmon? Well, for us, generally highly innovative, capital intensive, rapidly changing, forward looking, and supported by a highly skilled workforce. So what sits behind that? We identified 5 areas: supporting sustainable food, growing that species diversity, driving innovation, decarbonising operations, and growing the workforce. So I'll just touch on one because I'm conscious of timing, and that's the supporting sustainable food. So consumer preferences and experiences, and I'm sure we're all the same in the lead up to Chrissy when we're, looking at what we're putting in our supermarket trolley. But ultimately, consumer preferences and experiences will drive food production policies and practices. And so understanding how companies can maintain their access to markets, it's a really important piece in understanding, well, what your offer is, what's your proposition to the consumer. So the goal with this one really sat around Tasmanian salmon supplies seafood of the highest quality, nutritional value and sustainability credentials to meet domestic retail needs and export markets, exhibiting world's best practice. So how could you pilot a Tasmanian branded traceability platform through some of the peak bodies? How do you develop a Tasmanian seafood nutritional platform? How can you monitor Tasmanian brand sentiment, encourage real-time data disclosure for oceans beyond a single sector, deliver visual transparency of activities in shared waterways? Data reports mean one thing, but visual transparency offers a whole new level of building trust. And potentially establishing a trans-Tasman investigation into climate impacts on salmon farming and what that looks like. The impacts of these kinds of actions sit around consumer awareness and increased and informed decisions, accessible understanding of impact and progress against those material topics that I touched on earlier that have come from community, shared stewardship of the oceans, also with consumers and producers playing a role in that stewardship, improved information flow for transparency, support for Tasmanian salmon, a Tasmanian salmon industry climate ready or adaptation pathway, and progress towards the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. So what could Tasmanian aquaculture look like in the future? Well, let's have a look at the current trends and influences. Tasmania's aquaculture industry, it can be agile to navigate megatrends and those ongoing influences like community expectations, consumer nutrition, restoration ambitions, corporate social responsibility, and ocean equity. The competitive strengths that are already here at the table, Tasmania will grow its privileged assets and strong industry performance through locking in return on the ocean assets that are already available. And those assets sit around, well, we've got a temperate climate, got mature governance, we've got this available high energy oceans, this voluntary transparency and ESG reporting already in play, mature and modern aquaculture industry, existing infrastructure, this precision farming experience that's been brought to the table. We are a gateway to the temperate Pacific, Indian and Southern Oceans. There is an emerging novel feed sector that has a very strong footprint here in Tasmania, strong R&D institutions and platform, and a really strong emerging circular economy and waste solution philosophy and approach. So the thing is, Tasmania can lead. Tasmania genuinely can be leaders when it comes to oceans, and they can lead this concept of an equitable ocean economy bank. What's in the bank? Well, blue food, finfish, shellfish, seafood, blue carbon and these nature-based solutions, so seaweed, seagrass, mangroves, and the wetland biospheres. Blue leadership, this culture, this policy, this planning. Blue energy, and not in the context of, the ultimate goal is green energy, but blue from oceans. So, wind, wave, biofuels. And blue knowledge, literacy and data, education and training. So as a package, what we're really talking about here is a roadmap, starting from this Tasmania's ocean economy, bringing it down to that aquaculture sector, those competitive strengths, those 6 opportunities, the outputs that I've touched on. How do you go about that? Well, the next steps, as we've put forward, is you adopt an ambition through the development of an ocean strategy that sets out policies and principles for an integrated approach to Tasmania's oceans. You develop a statewide aquaculture sector strategy. And this is here where I'd insert other chapter. It could be a recreational fishery sector strategy, a commercial and offshore wind. That's what you can do. Then you develop the aquaculture investment R&D roadmap. And then you develop sectoral plans, subsectors that sit underneath that. And that's where a salmon plan might technically fit. And then you build in your monitoring, evaluation and learning process and steps along that space, which is going to be really, really important to understand success. So what are our next steps? We've got this ambition out there. It's been there for a month, and this methodology and outputs from our What We Heard document. Well, we're socialising these with our participants, with governments beyond Tasmania, but also Tasmania, with the industries, retailers, investors, and the community. To date, we've been encouraged to further investigate the ocean economy balance sheet concept. We've been encouraged to look at other ocean industries, other jurisdictions, and develop other sector chapters and how to scale it up or across or down. And we're also calibrating some of our current projects and also mapping out new projects and partnerships that contribute towards this ambition. At the end, we're confident that the adoption of this ambition, that it will drive an innovative and sustainable aquaculture industry, one for the future, not just for today, one that is balanced with nature and ultimately supported by innovation. And that's the conclusion. So I will stop sharing, and John, I'll put myself on mute so that you can jump in.
Thanks, Ange. And I'll keep yourself off of mute, because I think what we'll do is do a bit of a Q&A between the two of us. So there's been some questions that have emerged through the question and answer. And what I'd like to do is just sort of work through those, and we can just do that as a sort of a tag team effort. So Brian von Hertzen from the Climate Foundation has asked, says the United States suffers from 17 state and federal agencies all claiming jurisdiction over a lowly acre of seaweed cultivation. How can effective governance in Australia reform bureaucracy so that the Australian seaweed cultivator in the future will be able to cultivate a hectare without having to fund a $250,000 environmental impact statement for every hectare and every cultivator? So I think this goes to the heart of that question, or several questions. One is around harmonisation, but I think more deeply is about how do we have a regulatory environment that supports innovation. One where, as Brian is alluding to in his question, where seaweed cultivation at scale in the ocean is absolutely an emerging technology, at least in the Australian context. Other parts of the world are doing it in different ways and attempting it. I know Brian's very much involved in some of those opportunities. But to develop such an industry in Australia, Brian's right. A small pilot requires almost the same level of scrutiny as an industrial scale commercial operation. So I guess that's the question that's posed. That certainly goes to the heart of what we're saying around having innovation, having a regulatory environment that doesn't penalise innovation, doesn't penalise new solutions. So maybe, Ange, a couple of thoughts on that, and I might come back on some of those as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's really imperative that if the federal government or state governments are going to be prioritising or accelerating these new areas, these new industries or transitioning industries, that there is appropriate understanding of what that means for the emerging and incoming proponents, and also the existing proponents who are already out there as well. How do they understand and participate in that? But this concept of small to medium businesses being able to necessarily jump in at the scale of a major business and be able to have access to data in a particular way, it's just not achievable in many cases. So is there an opportunity for a one-stop shop concept that really helps support some of those? Are there examples in other countries that are already progressing in these spaces where, an acceptance of what an appropriate EIA looks like? I think is going to be a really important piece. And how do you group that information together? There's no point putting forward an acceleration area to accelerate and not having the appropriate blueprint alongside it to support that, to actually achieve it.
And so I think, just to sort of add to that, I think that a couple of things that come to my mind, and one is around evidence and risk.
Yeah.
And so what often a regulator is responding to is either an archaic piece of legislation that just doesn't have the flexibility to contemplate the new opportunity, or it can be around risk and who bears that. And often regulatory environments and regulators pass through the risk to the proponent, regardless of the proponent's capacity or ability to wear that risk. No matter how small the risk might be, the costs of wearing it could be extraordinary. So I think that it requires regulators to understand risk and to ensure that they adequately share that risk. It requires governments at times to take on some of that risk to facilitate emerging industries. Governments do this all the time across all sorts of sectors. They choose where they want to accelerate an industry and where some of that commercial or other risk. But it's also about through systems where the broader benefit, and this is where the ocean economy balance sheets and things like that can come to the fore, that some of these things have many positive nature-based upsides that aren't being considered in the regulatory environment. And so we hope through the ocean, the sort of ocean accounting type things and those balance sheets, that we're better sort of demonstrate where risk is and where reward is and where we should be putting some of that shape. And the harmonisation is also a really important one. So, I mean, the way our constitution is structured, states are responsible for effective natural resource management in the main, and then through our system of governance, that sort of, we have that state waters concept going out into Commonwealth waters. So it does provide a complex set of lines on maps, but we have got great examples throughout different sectors of the Australian economy where we have got harmonisation of approaches across borders. You can look to work health and safety, for example, as an example. So there are ways of having model legislation that's adopted by others, or principles that are adopted through essentially by all governments that they then use to underpin the regulatory environment. So it's not easy, but there are certainly ways of doing that. Look, the next question that came up, Ange, is how will transparency be accountable since the salmon industry is now fully privatised? There are no ASX companies anymore. So this goes to when you're a listed company, there are statutory reporting obligations that are placed upon you, and some of those go to sustainability and other metrics. Once you're no longer publicly listed, you're a private company, some of those obligations fall away. It doesn't stop you from being able to do it. It just takes away that kind of formal responsibility to do it and makes it voluntary. But Ange, this is absolutely your space. So I'll throw to you for your thoughts on this.
Yeah, and it's great being able to talk about this post-Montreal as well, because one of the targets within the framework, the new biodiversity framework, sits around transparency and disclosure from a nature-based perspective for commercial entities. So it's going to be really interesting to see how the Australian government bring that into the mix, and whether there is a acceptance and acknowledgement that just as the investment community and shareholders were looking for accountability on spend and how that sat against things that mattered most to them in the ESG space, environmental, social, and governance, whether there is a shift in thinking that just as shareholders had accountability and understanding, that maybe community do, and maybe consumers. And so this might be something that ends up being driven by consumers, by retailers, from a voluntary perspective, moves into a more formal aspect. Government calls for some level of transparency today, but, I always talk about your product gets to a door at a retailer based on meeting a regulatory setting. To get it through that door, you need a third-party sustainability accreditation, but to get it behind a deli or to get it into that next level, it really sits based on your voluntary commitments to sustainability more broadly. So I would hope that even in the absence of any of the three companies, as we're talking about, being listed on the ASX, that they would see that over a decade worth of sustainability reporting was a really valuable contribution towards understanding sustainability impact and being part of a journey towards achieving any of these objectives. Also really interested to see where government and retailers and others go in this space as well. But I think that this is where it's up to companies and others to really jump in to that next stage.
So I might just add something there, Ange, and maybe get your quick response to this as well. And that is that sort of tangential to this, some of the ESG reporting, not the ESG, the ERMS reporting that you touched on around community sentiment, looked at where do people get their information from about an industry. And in the context of the salmon industry, the response was basically local media was very high. So this is the local print, radio, television media. Social media was up there as one of the higher things, but where they weren't getting information from was things like the government salmon portal, as an example, just didn't rate a mention in 1,000 people. So things that have been set up to provide transparency just weren't being accessed. Now that could be a comment on that particular website, but where people are getting their information from is media. But having said that, in the context of transparency, just a couple of words around how do we get better information flow across.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really good point to touch on, John. And I think ultimately people are not just looking for information, they want it assured. It needs to be within a methodology that gives confidence to that. You know, we talked about earlier the fact that trust is a significant issue within this particular sector. So how do you build trust with data and information? And then the other thing is you could sit there and offer every single piece of data and it might not necessarily deal with the issues on hand. So having that materiality aspect, which really defines what matters, what's important, and what people want to know about is really important. So for example, when we did our conversations in the, what am I trying to say? When we did our workshops as part of the forum, we asked everyone in those separate sessions to list what matters most to them from a material topic perspective. And so that was really interesting because there was a lot of synergies and a lot of overlap. So for example, one of the topics that came up was welfare on stock, but also welfare on broader wildlife and those wildlife interactions. So having some more certainty and clarity on what that means beyond a regulatory perspective and beyond necessarily a accreditation perspective, I think is going to be really important. That translation of this data and information into something that is meaningful and makes sense to the person who's asked for it, I think is going to be really critical.
And just before we move off that, there was a question very specifically around what did welfare was the third most material issue in the first workshop, second. I think you just touched on it there. The question is really, what were the animal welfare issues that you think were being highlighted through that? And I think you just touched on it there, and it was a combination. Yeah,
I definitely think it was a combination. And you see that with a lot of food consumer kind of material at the moment as well, and input and feedback. It sits around wanting to know that the product you're consuming, that product grew, was reared, the husbandry was in a way that matches what you consider best practice and sits within that welfare space. And so a lot of the commercial retailers have expectations, and that's reported, and equally through sustainability certifications, or you could look at ones like RSPCA, which is very much in that space. But on the other side, it certainly was that aspect of you're operating in a shared marine environment. There's a lot of wildlife that just live there naturally. How are you intersecting with those, and how are you doing that in a responsible way? And what does accountability look like in that space?
Next question, and we'll try and do this one quickly because I think we could speak all day on it. So yeah. In the balance sheet, we talk about accounting, and the question is really about, does that concept extend to accountability to future generations?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I think that in my mind, that's certainly the evolution of a ocean balance sheet, is that it goes beyond just looking at what the accounting profile is, and that it actually provides an ability to understand impacts in a different way and be able to make decisions across the system. So that accountability sits in a decision-making process. I might be a farmer and I'm sitting there looking at my balance sheet and I'm going, well, I need to introduce a new net, that net type. What kind of material am I going to use given the solutions that are available from a recycling or reuse, repurpose perspective, so that you're accountable in making a decision and then watching the flow of that down through your life cycle assessment and into either circular economy loops or, you know, off to waste. And so there's accountability with those decisions that are being made, or from the farm perspective, as well as an accountability that's being made from a consumer. You know, I might choose that one of the issues I really, really care about is restoration. And so this balance sheet explains to me that this sector or this company or in this geography, that there's a consolidated effort in rehabilitating a particular ecosystem that might be a real, you know, motivator for me to choose that particular product or to support that particular industry. And so those motivations and that accountability will vary depending on who's using it. But that's the ultimate goal with a balance sheet, is we're not all sitting there with the same purpose and task at the end of the day.
And to Graham's specific question, we are absolutely considering intergenerational accountability in the balance sheet metrics, and we'll have more to say on that, not today.
Absolutely.
So there's a question here about whether we had input from individuals into this, and we might just, rather than specifically answering whether we talked to any one individual, but just generally, how did we frame up who we spoke to? I know the answer, but I'll throw it to you, Ange, because
absolutely. So our starting point really sat around key contributors and voices in the Tasmanian Salmon current conversation. So, you know, that really focused on who's participated in symposium activities, but then also who has been vocal, whether it's in media or through submissions to the LegCo, the LegCo inquiry that was undertaken down here in Tasmania, and inviting them to, or representatives from their organisations, those key organisations, to participate in the workshop.
And that's the point. Any organisation. We tried one way or another to reach out to any organisation that we have seen that are playing an active role in this space. So
absolutely. And if anyone was unable to attend, that was still maintained as an open invitation. And so I'm still anticipating, as we continue, that we'll continue to have these conversations, because this is a living process in many ways. That's our starting point. We really want both the ambition and the what we heard documents to define what we consider best practice for engagement and how we undertake our projects and move forward in this space more broadly.
Simon asks, are there any examples of where a CRC has been able to change significant state-based planning controls or pathways to be future driven, not based on, as you said, legislation devised 20 or 30 more years prior? We are trying really hard to do that. As would be well known, and you can see this on our website around the section on the Blue Economy Zone work that we're doing in Northern Bass Strait, in Bass Strait, north of Tasmania. We are trying to develop a way of doing research in Commonwealth waters for aquaculture that is contemporary and does draw on these concepts. We will be working with governments around how we do that, and it's a work in progress, but I'd like to think that we will be able to demonstrate that through time. But that's kind of a bit of a plug to have a look on our website on where we're at with work in the Blue Economy Zone. This is the area that has been well publicised north of Burnie. Look, I'm just looking at the time. I think we should skip through a few of these questions. We'll skip through these last few questions quickly. Do you think that an environmental balance sheet might encourage business investment decisions to take more account of environmental condition as both asset in its maintenance or a liability due to environmental degradation? And
you'd hope so. I think condition is such an interesting concept as well, isn't it? So what's the baseline for condition? And John, you might be able to add in based on some of the work you've done previously, where condition has been a really important piece in inland waters. But honestly, absolutely, you'd be assuming that and you would hope to think that if you were looking at a seascape and you're looking at a balance sheet, that it is not just about activity present absence, that it is about what dial you were trying to move. So if that dial is to restore, if that dial is to maintain, or if that dial is to reduce, or to halve, that you are actively working towards achieving those outcomes, which, you know, might be environmental, might be social, and might have some economic aspects there as well. But over to you, John, on some of your experiences as well around commission.
I think you've covered it off there.
Deal.
I was the next question is regarding blue knowledge, ocean literacy, and cultural practice. And to sort of cut this question short, basically, how would the blue economy engage with people socioculturally in the context of raising people's awareness regarding ocean literacy? So how are we going to go about increasing, raising people's awareness of ocean literacy, and what can we offer others?
Yeah, I think that's a beautiful question, and it's such an important area for something like a CRC, where we said at the start, we've got 43 participants, so we've got 43 voices who can share with their workforce, share with their broader people that they're connected to about what it is that we're doing as a whole, what we're finding. But at the end of the day, with any of the projects we're doing, I always talk about they can't just be like a book on a shelf or a file that you click on a computer. There must be much more around outreach. So the conclusion of our projects need to also build in an outreach component that provides additional information out there that helps set up what's next, and provide life longevity to these pieces of work. Ocean literacy more broadly is a really important aspect for good governance, and certainly the ability to future-proof an industry. Personally, I'm involved in the Seafood Industry Australia Aquaculture Advisory Committee on one of the projects that we're doing that's gratefully funded by FRDC, sits around stakeholder mapping, and that has a really strong oceans and aquaculture literacy piece towards it. I think there's a lot going on, and there's a lot more available. And I think the CRC has a really great voice, a trusted kind of voice to provide credible and achievable stories, but also, we're the nexus of blue economy knowledge capital and sectoral expertise. So I think that that's a really neat offering to that broader literacy piece.
Right. And this is more of a comment that's coming from Alan rather than a question, but I think it's a very timely one, and that is that, and I'll just read out what Alan's written. He said, the Commonwealth have announced reform of the EPBC Act that may provide the opportunity to develop some of the sustainable blue economy initiatives discussed today. This may provide an opportunity for stakeholders to progress these issues, and as well as how this might be best coordinated. So absolutely, this is one of those moments in time where legislation is being reformed, and it's one of those times where people have the ability to influence the direction of reform. And
yeah, absolutely. I feel like oceans gets 20-year cycles, and we're on a 20-year cycle right now. This feels very similar to back in the old EPBC Oceans Office days, and here we are right now on the cusp of a new EPA Act organisation, Sustainable Oceans Plan. Federally, you've got a lot of states looking at what they can do as well. So, Alan, I agree 100%. And here's the thing, what we've got in the ambition, it's been inspired by a lot of other efforts and activities out there. And to actually be able to achieve the ambition, it goes from being our ambition to your ambition, to everyone's ambition. So that ability to scale that up and look at, new partnerships, conversations, and ways to deliver this and implement this is going to be really exciting. And I think the EPA and the directions that the federal government are taking at the moment, whether it's nature-based solutions or it's blue carbon, the EPA, the Oceans Act, or a variety of other factors with biodiversity counts, I think we're in a really neat spot to, give this a really good shot for not just today, but tomorrow and those future generations.
I think that's probably a good place for us to sort of slowly just wrap up, or not slowly wrap up, but to wrap up. And I, just going to Andrew's point, the narrative that this Australian Federal Minister of the Environment was speaking at COP in Montreal was that notion of carbon neutral, nature positive. And so it is a there's a different paradigm for us all to be working in, and one with great opportunity, as Ange said. So that really, I guess, points to where to next for us and this work. And as Ange said during her presentation, that this is an evolving piece of work for the Blue Economy CRC. It's not put a report on the web and then move on to the next project. This is very much a live piece of work, and we've built the ambition that Ange has presented today very much through a particular sectoral lens. But the ambition works, in our view, across, in fact, it has to, otherwise it doesn't make any sense, across all ocean sectors, all those ocean industries that Ange put right at the very start. So we're going to go back through the ambition and work up some other sectoral chapters to add to the ambition story. We're also really keen on broadening the not so much the jurisdictional boundary, but broadening the geography through which we view this. And we're also very conscious that there are areas that we have really done in this first iteration of the ambition. And we've got work within the Blue Economy CRC that's addressing some of those things, starting to bring some of that knowledge to the fore, whether it's in First Nations, around the environmental accounting that we've touched on here. We can go a lot deeper than that. Other industries, like we've already said that, whether it's offshore renewables and some of the existing industries, but also some of the values along, like recreational fishing, for example, which is a part of our ocean economy, and where does that sit? So there are lots of opportunities for us to enrich this ambition, and we intend to do that. But it's not something that we can do in isolation. We have a number of projects that are afoot that are going to feed into that. We have a network of people and organisations that we'll be reaching into, both here and overseas. But there's still nearly over 100. We've had, we've probably got about 87 actually participants left still, 90 minutes into this presentation. We welcome your input and thoughts. And so, Ange and I are available. We have email addresses, we have phone numbers. You can get in contact with us and talk to us about that. So with that, I'd like to thank you very much for your time today. I'm sure Ange can do that, would like to do that as well.
Yeah, no, I definitely want to thank everyone for their time today. I want to thank John, Chris Carter and Marcus Howard as well, some of our Blue Economy CRC colleagues that helped with this work and were really, fundamental in helping us shape this, and really looking forward to working with everyone online today to talk about what's next and to continue this conversation.
And with that, I'd just like to wish everybody a happy holiday season, a safe one, and look forward to working with you on January the 3rd next year.
Yes, Jan the 3rd.
Or whatever you come back. All right. Thanks very much, everybody. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.